What happens when leaders fall? What happens when the people that we've looked up to commit acts so heinous that it shakes the very foundation of our beliefs? And in light of the recent allegations and subsequent investigative findings into Ravi Zacharias, the notable Christian apologist, we explore that topic on this episode, and we try to tackle some of the questions that have been coming out from our community. And warning to our listeners, we understand that the topics that we discuss on this episode might be very sensitive and triggering. So we advise that you skip this episode if that's the case for you. And to the victims of sexual abuse, know that there is help out there. A great resource for you is rainn.org, RAINN.org. It's the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. And so lots of great resources for you there. And also know that there's hope. Hope in Jesus, who not only restores our city, but us as people completely and wholly. Welcome, everyone, to the Restoring Our City podcast. On this episode, we are talking about a pretty serious topic that's impacted our community. And it's really sent some shockwaves, especially within the South Asian community. And definitely a tough subject to talk about, but I think it's relevant and very significant. And it's important that we talk about Ravi Zacharias, who, if you don't know, was a notable apologist from India, South Asian community. And he was an amazing apologist and world-renowned apologist. And he actually passed away last year, I believe in May. And recently, there's been, investigative reports into sexual misconduct in his actions and lots of evidence against him. And it's really disrupted just the legacy of what he's done. And it's really sent some shockwaves and then ripple effects to folks who really came to know the Lord through his teachings. And so I thought it was really important for us to kind of talk about this subject today. And joining with me on this episode are my fellow Rock collaborators, Alvin Matthew, who's a church leader for several years within the Chicagoland area, decades of experience impacting our community. Alvin is on with us. Alvin, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Joey. How you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for being on.
Yeah, definitely.
It's somebody who I talk apologetics with all the time is Alvin, and I appreciate your insight. And along with Alvin is my brother and fellow Rock collaborator, Joel Varghese, who's the church director of church partnership with RIMI, and obviously has a lot of experience with international ministry as well. And so I know this hits home as well, just kind of hearing this situation. And Joel, how's it going today?
I'm keeping well and glad to be back. It's like I take a break every few months and just pop back in.
Yeah, we decide to have you back or not. We always wrestle with that. No, but thanks, Joel, for being on. And I think it's important to have both of your insights into this. I think over the years, just, with all of us collaborating in Rock and just talking about the gospel with our fellow friends, I can't name how many times we've brought up Ravi Zacharias' teachings in small group or different events and things like that. And especially being South Asian, I know many of our listeners who might be South Asian and listening to this have heard Ravi Zacharias' teachings and maybe read his books and were really impacted by his ministry. And so, Alvin, do you want to kind of talk to us a little bit about just the context of this situation and what occurred?
Yeah, so for starters, Ravi Zacharias, like Joby said, is a probably the most prominent Christian apologist of the 21st century. So very well-known man, not only within Christian circles, but even internationally throughout many Islamic and atheist countries. All, basically welcomed him with open arms. He had an incredibly great reputation among basically everyone. And I think this past May, he actually ended up passing away from cancer. And I believe this August or October, some allegations came out and were brought up to his organization, RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. It's an apologetics organization. And they these allegations were brought up, and basically there were some sexual misconduct allegations. There was potential abuse or mishandling of just funds, and a whole bunch of various allegations that were going on. So RZIM then pursued I guess it's a private investigator, but it was a third-party private investigator to just fully investigate the whole situation and really just try to figure out what was happening, just get down to the truth. And then in December, I believe they released some preliminary findings, which were pretty damning and kind of very disappointing to hear, but not a full report. And the report kind of tended to point that there's a good probability that these allegations are true, or there's some substance to what was being said. Then I believe a couple weeks ago, within February, the full report, a 13-page report, was released, and it detailed many different incidences, and it tried to characterize a whole basically pattern of behavior. And there were a lot of I guess underlying assumptions within phone calls, or even things saved on phones and communications back and forth to various people, that were kind of indicating that, hey, it seems like this isn't necessarily legit, or there's some stuff that's kind of a little bit shady or not exactly above board. And then in doing this, also Ravi's family, or many of Ravi's family members, are also part of his various organizations that help out in some kind of way. So they're obviously also impacted. There are numerous victims that are involved in this situation. There's just it's really a heartbreaking situation. There's a lot of stuff going on, and the worst part of it is, Ravi Zacharias has passed away, so there's really no way we can get any kind of closure or finality on what actually happened, or just some background. We're just kind of digging for evidence and kind of letting the evidence speak for itself, no matter how damning it may seem.
Yeah, and I think it's really eye-opening and alarming when we see this. And I think first thing that we think of, and I think we should think of, is the victims and the folks that are impacted by these allegations. And at the same time, it's evidence, right? And I think we want to get into the conversation a little bit about that. And I appreciate you kind of setting the stage, Alvin. So what has been the response, I guess, from those within the camp, and maybe what are some of the reactions to some of these findings?
Yeah. So as a whole, RZIM, I think, like on a personal note, I would say they are probably dealing with this the best way that they can. They're being very forthcoming about, look, there's an independent investigation. We're going to stand by what the findings are. They're not impeding anything. They're really just trying to be as transparent and above reproach as possible, which I think is definitely the right way to approach this situation. And also, I believe there has been a slightly different response from Ravi's family. I don't want to say different. I don't know if that's fair, but more classifying response, where the report is very cut and dry, like it's evidence based. Here's evidence. It's yes or no, very black and white. And I think even Nathan Zacharias, Ravi Zacharias' son, even said, you guys are approaching this from the sense of like, oh, he's Ravi Zacharias, founder of RZIM, but you're neglecting the fact that he's also Ravi Zacharias' husband, father, grandfather, uncle, son. Like, he's a person, and we're all, human. So I think maybe Nathan's intent was to kind of soften sort of the bleakness of the report and say, like, it's very easy now that he's gone just to be very cut and dry about it, but to realize we're all human and we all have, we all struggle with things, but that doesn't dismiss anything that he has done or has been alleged that he's done. It's it's very challenging, because we have not only the assault victims, we have the family that's victims, we have the friends and coworkers who are also now technically victims, who are technically, they were basically like participating in ministry with him, not realizing all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes.
I do want to read a part of the report, just kind of the initial outset, just to kind of give some folks, if you haven't heard about the story or haven't read the report or know what's going on. I mean, some of the evidence that was found in the report, I'll just kind of read from a blurb here. So we also reviewed Mr. Zacharias' electronic devices and found evidence of text and email-based relationships with women who were not his wife, as well as over 200 selfie-style photographs of women. It's interesting if you hear the story that, just this investigation looked at folks within the U.S., even though Ravi Zacharias was, world renowned and went overseas and potentially had relationships with women in different countries as well. And so it just seems, it seems really damning, like you said, Alvin.
Yeah, it's very tough. Yeah.
It,
And I think it's also fair to, I think for us being transparent, it's also important, being Christians, that, we don't just view someone because of their sin, right? So we don't necessarily know that because, like, Ravi's not here anymore, we see the list of sins, which is like, oh wow, that's incredibly damning. But we actually don't know what else could be going on behind the scenes. Maybe he was struggling with addiction. Maybe there was other problems that were like adding to this. It unfortunately paints a very empty picture for us to try to figure out what's happening, right? And I think we have to come to terms with there won't be any kind of closure. It's pretty much just, hey, is there potential for evidence? Is there a potential wrongdoing? If so, that's kind of unfortunately going to lead us in a direction that we may not hope.
Yeah. Before I get into that, I just want to share just briefly because personally, this news definitely hit me, just as Alvin shared, and I did not know Ravi Zacharias personally, but I did have the privilege to meet him on two occasions, and that was in India, and just a regular guy, and just to think, especially being an Indian, when you look at another Indian person, you automatically think, oh, that's your uncle, and he was just very down to earth the way he talked to you, and so just to hear this, it just like what you just didn't want to believe it. But as Joby shared earlier, I just want to pause here, just to with all the victims, all the women who were affected, who were taken advantage by him, we are praying for you. And we do not understand the depth of your pain, but we know that Jesus does. Jesus knows the depth of your pain, and he is the only one who can bring the healing and the peace that you need. And I pray that you continue to cling on to him. And it is sad. And what Ravi Zacharias did was wrong. It was sinful. And I was just thinking today that though his sin may have destroyed his legacy, it does not destroy the truth
Yes.
that he preached. And the truth is that Jesus saves. And for many who have been led to Christ by Ravi Zacharias, I just read a tweet earlier a week ago by a girl named Jennifer Greenberg. I love what she said, and she said, "If you feel you're led to Christ by Ravi Zacharias and feel shaken, please hear me. You were not saved by any man, but by the Holy Spirit working through a sinner. Regardless of his wickedness, the Spirit who called you is holy. Cling to God. Do not fear. He is faithful." And I think that's so important to know is that is Jesus is the one who saves, not man. He uses man. He uses people to preach and teach the gospel, but it is it's hard because when you and that's something we have to repent of. We idolize these people, right? We idolize people like Rabbi Zacharias, our pastors, our ministers, because we put them up on such a high pedestal and that thinking that they would never ever fail.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point too, right? Like there's people who are wrestling with this to say, wow, did everything that I learned from this guy, is it a lie? And I'm hearing a lot of the critiques, and I haven't watched everything, and that's why I definitely want to rely on you guys to inform me about this situation and our listeners. And there's a lot of videos out there, there's reactions and things like that to say, wow, I always knew this guy was sleazy, or I always knew this thing. And it was interesting because I looked at this differently, because as South Asians, we look at him and we resonate, right? We resonate with him because he's like, Joel, you mentioned, like our uncle. Sometimes, like we meet him and you're like, oh man, you're like our uncle. And it's great. It's like one of us who's doing some amazing work. And it's I think there are some people who have negative reactions might not resonate or empathize or have that relation like a South Asian community member might, right? So like, what do we tell those folks who are wrestling with, man, do I need to just go back to the drawing board, or how can we help folks who are a little rattled by this and maybe are shaken in their faith legitimately, right?
Yeah, I think I can kind of take that a little bit. Like, just to share, even from my own perspective, like Ravi Zacharias is one of the first first preachers or even apologists that I was, fond of, that I could even talk to like my uncles about. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, you heard about Ravi Zacharias? Yeah, I loved him. I've read all his books. I've heard him 20, 30 years ago. And, 20, 30 years later, I'm catching on. And it's like, oh, wow. Like that's, and being a South Asian second gen American or second gen Indian is we don't have many like preachers in common, right? Like there's not many preachers I idolize that my parents are like, yeah, like that guy's preaching is on fire, right? And so for us who have like looked up to Ravi and have benefited from his teaching, the thing that like I feel has always reminded me, or the scriptures reminded me, is that God uses sinners for his ministry, right? And now that doesn't condone their sin, that doesn't approve or shove what they did under the rug, but it's it would be unfair for me to singularly just judge Ravi because of sin and say, I'm going to disqualify you in your ministry. Because technically, I'm also a sinner in need of grace. And any ministry or anything I've done should then theoretically be disqualified.
I never even thought about that, Alvin, the connection between the older generation and the younger generation, or the new generation, or the 2nd gen. We don't have a lot of those figures, because it's so early, right? And, our parents immigrated here for the first time. And so that's a really great point. And kind of to piggyback on that too, I heard, folks were saying, don't buy his books, don't review his teachings, disassociate yourself from his work because of this, right? We just want to forget his memory. And I don't want to discount how horrible the sin and the impact to the victims are. But I think it's worthwhile to ask that question, like, do we just disregard his teaching? Is there value still there that we should refer to?
Yeah, that's hard to. I've been thinking about that personally, because especially preaching and teaching, I'm probably not going to use Ravi Zacharias quotes for some time, because right now it's just too fresh, and to be honest, that could just trigger people. And the whole point of when you're sharing the gospel, you want them to lead them to Christ. You don't want to distract them with other things. And yeah, unfortunately, using his name right now will distract them and the truth. But we can't erase um, his teaching, his ministry, because through him, he has led many, many to Christ, and those people will be in heaven, and yeah, I don't know. I think right now it's probably not the best thing to do, but we have to like really take a step back and stop idolizing people, and stop worshiping people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where my head is going. And I guess as far as, my next question, which is like this idea of hero worship of folks in, prominent positions. Where's the dangers in that? And how does that impact our community? And why is hero worship so bad?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting because I think I read an article recently that like technically Ravi didn't exhibit any of the flaws of hero worship. He typically didn't have messages that were really focused on himself. He wasn't typically ever lifting up like the Ravi brand or the RZIM brand. He was basically promoting apologetics. He was promoting the gospel. And so it's incredibly surprising to see like how this turned out. But for hero worship, we have, I think, uh, I think when Billy Graham passed away, I did like a message on like, oh, we probably won't have many more like blameless preachers. Like someone's going to have a scandal. Someone's going to have something. And in my mind, Ravi was right there next to him. Like, oh, Ravi passed away in May. Like, wow, he's probably the end of the era. And then now come to find out, well, he actually wasn't even the end of the era. But I think it should humble us as leaders that any of us are so close to potentially falling. And it's not like we become magically inoculated from this deception just because we get to a higher level of prominence or popularity or whatever. And for hero worship, I think ultimately, I think it's like Paul says it in scripture. It's you shouldn't look to me or my teaching, but you should like use me as a window and look through me to Christ. Any of us is susceptible to it because we worship people as heroes because we also secretly want that for ourselves, right? We want to be like lifted up. We want people to think we're impressive or capable or whatever it is.
It's sad when you see things like this happen in our community. And at the same time, it's not just this Ravi Zacharias situation because he was a South Asian leader. This is this issue of sexual abuse has been happening in our community. And speaking as an Indian Christian, I've been to conferences where we've had seminars and talks about sexual abuse happening in the church from local churches, pastors that you might know. And I'm not afraid to say that. Like I'm not going to say evidence or names or accuse people. I just want to make sure that we understand that this is not just like, oh, this is a prominent person that this happened to. This happens within our local church. And I guess you can kind of hear the emotion in my voice. This makes me mad when I think we all are a little upset about these types of situations. And not only just because it happens, because it happens to people we know, or, and that breaks my heart. Right. And I guess my question to you guys is how are we handling this as a local church? And are we doing it the right way? What is our responsibility when it comes to publicly rebuking this? And how should we go about that?
Even before we analyze that question, I think even with the situation with Ravi Zacharias, even RZIM, how they handle the situation. I've talked to a number of churches the past few weeks and just different Christian organizations, and they're just talking about reconstructing what accountability looks like. And, and that's a good thing. And I think a lot of, especially in our Indian community, because of the honor shame system, leaders are afraid to be vulnerable. They're afraid to share their sins with one another, especially when you look at leadership. And I got to tell you, I've heard many pastors and leadership, especially in the Indian community, they'll say, I'm only accountable to God. The moment that pastor says that, it's a red flag. Leave that church. Seriously.
Yep.
If you can't,
jump ship, guys.
Seriously. I mean, if you're in leadership, and you can't be able to be real with one another, man, there's something wrong, and and I'm not saying I'm perfect, I'm a sinner saved by grace, but I'm realizing that especially in leadership, you have to be vulnerable with one another. You have to trust one another, and you have to be able to confess certain sins, certain struggles you may be going through. Because, dude, think about it. If you just keep that stored sin, keep it hidden, it's just gonna get worse. And again, I can't talk too much in depth about what he dealt with because he is gone. But I can just only imagine, he, like Alvin, you shared earlier about it, he may have been struggling with a lot, and he probably could not share these struggles with people. And and then when you reach a certain status in the community, there's no way you would feel comfortable sharing, because then people will just dismiss you, and that's wrong.
Is that because, like, and I want to stay there, Joel, because you brought up an interesting point. It's not to excuse what he's done.
Exactly.
I want to say that
Right,
80
right.
times.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
It's not to excuse what he's done.
Yes.
But like, is there a fear from leaders, especially maybe they might not be at the status level of Ravi Zacharias, but maybe there are leaders who are struggling with sin, who can't acknowledge it because of the fear of what would happen to the ministry?
Well, you made a good point, because I was reading, one of the victims actually shared that, where Ravi did say, if you please do not tell anyone, because this can just affect the ministry, and we would lose millions of people, millions of souls, and of course, I mean, that was wrong of him to say that, and just at first put that weight on her, and this person saying that if you tell anyone, no one's gonna hear the gospel anymore. That right there, when I read that account, I was upset, because you automatically make it seem like only RZAM can really preach the gospel, and that's not the case, but I think so. I think you're right, Joey, is that especially when you reach a certain status in ministry, you become afraid. You become afraid that the ministry will shut down, and it's not gonna. And I think it's really just an excuse to say, "Oh, we're not gonna be able to save people." I think the excuse is you're losing your position, you're losing your status, you're losing your respect in the community.
Yeah, And just to add on to Joel's point, I think he said it perfectly. If there's a pastor that says that they're only accountable to God, that is probably the biggest red flag that there can be.
Yes.
Even I'm thinking about that, like as I like study church leadership and stuff, there are a couple of prominent pastors I follow, and one of them actually I think he got married at like 19, and then a year into his marriage, he actually committed infidelity. So before he became a big pastor, there was a big scandal. And so he said, once he started getting into ministry and getting more serious about ministry, he said, there is one person in my life that knows where I am without question 24/7. 365. And anytime they ask, where are you? I respond. If I don't respond, that means they have the authority to shut all of my ministry and everything down, because I'm not willing to be accountable and be transparent. And he said that because he believed that God had this enormous call on his life. And he said, that call is way too valuable for me to even slightly think about anything that could potentially not be above reproach. And so when I think about that, and then I see like, okay, now the Ravi situation, I was like, okay, there's a huge, huge difference here. And speaking from the South Asian perspective, this pastor has to trust this person who he's given the authority to kind of close down his ministry, right? In Ravi's situation, he's basically, I mean, it's almost unfair to say he was at the top of his field. He was literally at the pinnacle of like respect and his field technically, to where he probably felt like he didn't have any equals or like co-laborers, as it were, right? And I think like one of the benefits of like Rock is like we've always had each other. So if one of us started slipping, literally I'd get a call, hey man, let's get some lunch. Like we all keep each other accountable. And if anyone, no matter what level of ministry you're in, if you don't have like at minimum that, let alone if you're a pastor and you don't have another pastor or elder or committee who you're accountable to, then like you're like God has set up leadership in a way to protect us, to be like fruitful. So we're literally operating outside of that and being like, well, I'm getting all this success, so I'm probably good. I'm probably, I'm seeing a lot of fruit from what I'm doing. But the reality is like we really have to like pursue accountability and transparency, and like we need, like I like to use the word co-laborers, because it's literally people that are working with you alongside you, who you like, they know your struggle, they know what it's like to do ministry, they know what it's like, the hardships and the challenges that come along with it, so they can understand. But at the same time, they'll be real with you, right? Like if I started slipping, I don't question that you guys would literally be like, hey, you got to chill, you got to calm down.
I think it's important to have these conversations. And I'm sure the folks maybe who are listening have questions and want to dig into the story more and might read into some of the details. And I think what we really want to share here is, yes, these kind of things happen, and it might be even triggering for some of our listeners who might be listening to this. These are sensitive topics. And I think what we're talking about here, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, even if you might be a victim of sexual abuse, I just want to let you know that there is hope out there. We've kind of alluded to the gospel a couple of times already in this episode about the hope that we have in Jesus and who can restore us completely in everything that we do. Also, even practically, for resources, there are so many resources and there's help available for you. And so I think one great organization is RAINN, RAINN, which is the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. You can find a lot of resources at rainn.org. So if you have suffered from sexual abuse or want to find more information or get more resources, please check out rainn.org. Guys, thanks for being on. I appreciate your insight into this very important topic, and we definitely are thinking and praying for the victims, and I hope our community can be the catalyst for change to help prevent these types of situations from occurring in the future.